I'm someone who's always found liberation in my imagination and in the imagination of others. I love fantasy worlds that exist between imagination and reality, particularly due to the imaginative possibilities they open up. I love that we live in a world in which an author, whether they be a writer, filmmaker, poet, or even musician, is able to create and invent a whole new world of stories, and that they are able to invite others, like you and I, into those stories.
When I was younger, I spent a lot of time by myself daydreaming or watching TV or imagining other worlds. I had this recurring dream where I could fly. As a result, in my waking hours, I would get on the roof and jump in the hopes of liftoff. But gravity had its way every time. I've always wondered what happens to our childhood dreams. When is it that we let them go? When is it that we are too adult to believe the fantastical? I dream less now than I did then. At times I've accepted the world as it is, thrown my hands up, and just let it be.
I think there's a misunderstanding that imagination and fantasy is just for children, and that adults must be rooted in reality. Perhaps it's a misconception of the power of imagination as a tool for inventing the future. To me, though, imagination and storytelling isn't something that simply exists for escapism. It's not about escaping my present reality and going somewhere else, but it's about staying in my body and allowing my mind to expand and grow in capacity for new possibilities and new realities in our world.
For a brief moment, there appears a crack in reality, just enough to allow the light of imagination in. Like the steam dancing in the sun on a morning coffee, or a shooting star at night, or the smell of the forest after rain. Something hopeful and beautiful, a glimpse. And that makes me wonder again. In some ways, a world of love, liberty, justice, and freedom seems like that fantastical truth I held on to as a child.
Perhaps we can seek a kind of embodied imagination. Imagination which is not just a form of escapism to escape our current realities from the systems of injustices and oppression which our cosmos and so many humans living in it faces.
What we are living through in this moment of the world is polycrisis, to use a hip word, multiple and compounding crises of planetary proportions. And that makes dreaming feel almost futile. But if we extend the metaphor, perhaps we can look for gaps in reality that allow just a glimpse of a better world.
I wonder what would happen if we went searching for glimpses of those gaps in reality which enable us to dream.
I wonder if those gaps appear more frequently in storytelling.
And what would happen if we actively cultivated rehumanizing spaces for both telling and hearing such stories?
Would it inspire hope that a better and more beautiful world is not just possible, but that we can be part of making it so? Hello, this is Tristan.
And this is Rashid.
Welcome to the Liminal Space Podcast. You're so extra.
Okay. As you can see, we don't take ourselves too seriously. Maybe let's redo that.
I think it's fine if you...
Okay. Let's just redo it again.
In case you have a serious take of it.
Okay.
Hello, this is Tristan.
And this is Rashid.
Welcome to the Liminal Space Podcast.
A space for dreaming, imagination, living, and storytelling. And as a starting point in grounding the space, we thought that it would be helpful to share a little bit about the context and place where we're recording from.
So we're recording from southern suburbs today. That's correct. Right, Rush?
What city? People don't know where the southern suburbs
are. In Cape Town, southern suburbs. And I guess top of mind this week, actually, is that Cape Town was voted one of the best places to live in the world.
Yeah.
And best place to visit is consistently also the best place to visit. And also beautiful. Often it's like the most beautiful. It's often voted as the most beautiful place to.
We're sure that there's probably a lot of people from Cape Town listening to this. If you're not from Cape Town, I guess our land centerpieces is Hurikwaho, which is known commonly as Table Mountain. On Table Mountain, there's a little plaque, actually, which I always laugh at when I read it. And it speaks about how Table Mountain alone has more biodiversity than in the entire United Kingdom. We have like we at the southwesternmost tip of the continent of Africa, and we have currents from the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. So yeah, it's altogether a good and beautiful place. Some people would call it heaven on earth.
Yeah, some people would call it heaven on earth. It would be a must to not mention whenever the marketing material for Cape Town is always about the energy, the vibrancy. There's all of this cool stuff happening with the color, diversity, and all of that kind of thing. That is also here, which I guess is also like heaven. Yeah. Some would say.
So together with the great beauty, that we have in the city, all these things we've mentioned, it's also a city with great pain and ongoing oppression. Living in this space, we hold the fact that Cape Town is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, together with another reality that Cape Town is one of the cities with the most inequality in the world. It's one of the cities with the most segregation in the world. The inequality and segregation, for example, are generally based on racial divides, which are vestiges of South Africa's apartheid policy, which literally means separateness and forced separate development among different peoples, different humans.
And so one of the outworkings of that, to another stat that I'm looking at, is that Cape Town also is consistently ranked as one of the most violent cities in the world when looking at the murder rates. And in 2022-2023, it was 12th on the list in the world. And so it's interesting to think about, when we talk about apartheid, which sides of this, almost like there's these two sides of the city, that the one is very beautiful and the other one is super dangerous and is not well serviced. And it's like two different cities.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, because it can't be the best city to live in but also have the highest murder rate.
Exactly.
That doesn't make sense.
One of the apartheid's policies was forced removals. I think it was the beginning of last year. A bunch of us went for like a hike. We were above, was it Constantia Neck?
Yes.
Yeah, and we were talking about how it's so beautiful, like right below us, it's just green, there's just trees and everything. And as you go, further away from the mountain, you go into what they call the flats, the Cape Flats. And the Cape Flats are known for being like dry and arid. A lot of people, especially black and colored South Africans, were sent there, removed from the beautiful places by the mountains and the beaches, and sent to those places.
So someone actually was speaking to me about how when you are in the southern suburbs where we are, you hear birds and there are trees, and when you go to other areas in Cape Town, like in the Cape Flats, there aren't birds, or you can't hear the sound of birds or trees or things like that. And that's also an interesting thing about the city and how divided it is, that it can be so different between those two things. So we are quite close to the mountain now, though, Rashid. We are kilometers away, not very many kilometers.
There, but we're
there.
Exactly. So that's kind of the context that we're speaking from, holding the realities of a beautiful city where, especially if you're privileged, you have access to the mountains and the beaches, the forests. For some people, you have access to those things. For others, that access is not granted, or it's not easily accessed.
Yeah. So I guess what we're talking about today is like trying to make sense of living with both of those being realities, that we're not living with only one. We're not just living in the most beautiful city, we're also living in the most dangerous city. And so we need to make sense of that somehow.
Yeah.
And that's a question, I guess.
Exactly.
To all of us, but to the two of us as well.
Yeah. I also think it's helpful to not be blind to that reality, especially for people like myself. I will speak for myself, who has access and privilege to a lot of, the beauty that Cape Town has to offer, to not be blind and to not just live and exist in a bubble and be like, yeah, Cape Town's this, and then, for example, crying about crime or something. Because why does crime exist? Because poverty exists. Why does poverty exist? Because injustices exist. Why do injustices exist? Because there are systems in place that, like I was saying earlier, the very word apartheid means separateness. And part of that separateness is this really unjust separation of humans and these systems which divide which dehumanize, and we hope to have some conversations and to tell some stories that bring humanizing.
Yeah, and I guess that's how we locate in the conversation, first of all, in Cape Town, but then also that I guess all of this reality of separateness, that it isn't the end state or the ideal state, that there's a current reality and there's something that's better than what there is now. And so that's where the name of this podcast is coming from, is that this is a liminal space. It's an in-between space. The city itself, we believe, is like that, because in time, it's not what it can be or what it should be. And so the city of Cape Town is a liminal space. And in a similar way, the podcast is a liminal space for ideas to be processed, for us also to think and learn as we go through the different storytelling that we do. That the podcast itself is, in a sense, a liminal space. It's an in-between space where we can try to make sense of that question about how do we live in Cape Town in between that hopeful future state and what it is like at the moment.
I guess being in this in-between place where we're longing for something more, we're longing for a world that is restored, where goodness and wholeness and justice abounds. I guess there's this question about, is that possible? Is it just a dream? Is it just a fantasy? We opened this this podcast with a little thing about how, when we were children, and I guess we want to explore and ask the questions, is it possible for these fantasies to become reality, and perhaps is it possible for imagination to become reality?
And I guess also is that a waste of time? Because I guess some people would say, like, that's a pipe dream, things will never be that way. And so is that just a waste of time? And that's a question that we are asking. But I guess for the both of us, we both believe that it is possible, although we acknowledge that there is the current reality and the legacy of the past and all of those kinds of things. And so the task, I guess, is how do we make sense of that now? Because we can also be very idealistic, and in our heads we idealistic in our beliefs and how we think things should change, and that could lead us to do nothing. So we'd become paralyzed in that moment, because it's like, well, I can't do anything, because if I try anything I'll get it wrong. Or we're prone to just analyzing the problem, diagnosing what's wrong. We've often had conversations about like that vision of tearing down and building up, those kinds of things. Are they mutually exclusive? And so I guess that's part of what we're also trying to answer. And part of that is we think that to be able to live and to exist in that tension, we need to have a way to make us be able to work into the future, which is imagination is a part of that.
Yeah, exactly. Because when we look at the world and I guess the mess and injustices and everything, often what can happen is we feel like paralyzed into being like, this is not okay. We know it's not okay from the bottom of our spirits and our minds. We feel it in our bodies that it's not okay, but sometimes we paralyze and we don't even know what to do. Are there glimpses, are there spaces, are there gaps where we can find a moment where we can breathe and we can be like, wow, we could actually imagine something different and something more beautiful, than the present.
Yeah. I think you said, or one of us said in that beginning thing, that stories could enable that kind of glimpse. And I wondered what you thought about that, as stories as a tool or as a mechanism that can help us see a different future.
Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. A couple of years ago, I did a book study in which we read and went through this book called The Sacrifice of Africa by Ugandan author Emmanuel Katongole. And when I read it, it completely changed my idea of stories and how important they are. What Katongole discusses in the book is the importance of interrogating stories, interrogating them and looking and seeing, is this harmful? And if it's harmful, how can I replace that with a different story? There's one thing that he mentions about how stories, they begin as assumptions, and then when they get institutionalized, they begin to structure life, which leads them to becoming so naturalized that we don't actually view them as stories, but as facts, and that they're just part of, the way things are.
I was thinking of something like that, where as you were speaking, an example of that is the myth of the empty land in Africa when colonizers arrived.
Yeah.
That there was a story that was told that there was no one here when settlers arrived, and therefore people were able to take land and make it their own. And that was somehow a just kind of thing that was done. And I mean, until very recently, even, I think that would have been a story that was post-institutionalized and then become a fact that everyone would believe that is the truth.
Yeah.
But we know that isn't the truth. And so that's interesting, because that is a story that exists in South Africa, right?
Exactly. Yeah, in South Africa and all around the world. So, for example, just to use this idea of what I'm talking about, interrogating stories and then, I guess, rejecting when they're harmful and dehumanizing, and then replacing it with a different story. The story is this idea of discovery with a capital D.
Yeah.
It's famously known as the doctrine of discovery. And there's a whole story behind this idea of taking land. The story is framed as, Europeans hopping on ships and discovering different lands and peoples and spices. And it was this whole imaginative narrative around exploration and discovery and all of these kind of things. And then we left with this story which has been told literally for a few hundred years about discovery. Recently, in the last decade or two, you have a lot of indigenous people talking about this idea of discovery and realizing that that's based on a story about superiority of humans. So when you're talking about lands where people exist and there's still this narrative of discovery, you realize that the story behind that was one of dehumanization, that the indigenous people who lived there, whether it's in Africa or the Americas or wherever it is, were not fully human. And you have now indigenous people retelling this Eurocentric story of discovery and retelling it and saying, no, but you can't discover lands where people already lived on unless you view them as subhuman or as not fully human. So then all of a sudden there's this retelling, and then it's almost like in your imagination now you have different possibilities to view discovery, the idea of discovery. And what I will personally do when I view that, I'm like, bro, that's not discovery, man. No, I'm rejecting that.
Yeah.
And rather I will replace that with a different story, because I think that story that's been told is dehumanizing towards people. It's told through certain lenses as well. And it's dehumanizing towards people, fellow humans who I view as, beautiful gifts and who are sacred. So I reject that and I desire a new story.
Yeah. So it's interesting in that framework as well to think about our little back and forth about Cape Town earlier on, because then what does it mean when we think about the story of Cape Town being the best city in the world? What does that mean for the group of people who are living in the most violent city in the world? Who gains from either of those narratives, I guess. And that's something I guess that's why we kind of tongue-in-cheek in a way. Sometimes we were speaking about how Cape Town is the best city when we know it's super divided, also super unequal. And we know that some people in the city get more benefit out of it than others.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting. The story we tell about Cape Town, even in that framework you've just shared, is quite an interesting thing to consider as well. We don't think that obviously storytelling is now going to go and build roads and bridges and fix everything in the city, or fix everything in the world all of a sudden, or everything that's wrong with society. But that it is an important thing if we are going to try to rethink our current reality.
Yeah, exactly. Often when I talk to people like this, they're like, okay, bro, so what can we do? What are the solutions? What are the quick fix programs? And the whole point is that it's like the entire narrative of the things we believe about humanity is often so harmful. Even if it's like in religious beliefs and these kind of things, a lot of the time we frame things through harmful imaginations and stories. Things like power and conquest and dominance and control as a means, to bring peace. And I guess part of the reinvention of a future where we long for restoration and wholeness is saying, in the present, can we actually reject the pursuit of power and dominance? Can we reject that, and can we desire something different? Can we frame success, for example, through something different? And in that way, this idea of reinventing the future, or inventing the future even, is saying, can we just sit and have conversations and share some stories and listen to, it's a very important part as well, listen to stories and reject all these dehumanizing narratives that we believe, because even things like power and dominance, it's always power over people, it's always dominance over people, okay, also over animals and over, the planet and stuff, which is another story and an important thing as well. Yeah, I guess the idea is just asking for something that helps us give meaning to our lives and to give us an alternative imagination to live from, to love from, to breathe from. And
I guess the way we do that is not Rashid and Tristan are not coming up with new imaginations for a whole bunch of different things. The idea of the podcast is that we get different people, and I guess some of the people that we have in mind are maybe people whose stories or things they're doing in the world is not always highlighted, or because it doesn't fall into that dominant narrative, as you said, with power and all of that kind of thing. And so some of it is marginalized voices, but also there's a diversity of voices that we can benefit from hearing. So our intention is to have a whole bunch of different people sharing stories over a couple of different episodes on different topics, in the hopes that we can think of these a better imagination for what the world could be like.
This first episode, it was just sort of like an introduction into the motivation for us even wanting to sit down and have conversations with each other and also with other people, and to hear different stories, like you're saying, in the city, and viewing all of these stories in the context of acknowledging that there's something wrong in the world and longing for everything to be made right in a non-escapist way, in a non-utopian sort of dreaming thing, but being like, surely there's something more, surely we can long for something more, and that we can see something more, we can see a future that's marked with hope and peace and justice and restoration.
So that's the podcast idea, that this is a liminal space that we are creating, where we're going to enter into story or storytelling and hearing stories so that we can imagine. And again, we're not positioning ourselves as experts or anything like that. It's more out of curiosity, and also feeling more comfortable with a level of mystery and uncertainty. I guess in the world, we've lost quite a lot of the ability to sit in mystery and uncertainty. Like we always want to know. And we just invite you to come with us.
Yeah.
Great. Do you want to do an altar call?
No. Yo, bro. That's funny. Yeah.
This is Tristan.
This is Rashid.
Goodbye for now.